As a fan of popular media, there are certain questions that seem impossible to answer objectively. What is the greatest science fiction film of all times? Who is the best Batman? What is the greatest video game ever made? No matter how much you have seen, no matter how much you have played, it is almost impossible to answer. A few months ago, I stumbled upon a YouTube channel dedicated to making shorts of Mission Impossible scenes backed by this song, and I found myself stuck in a loop. I had not watched any Mission Impossible movies before, but after consuming almost the entire Mission Impossible catalog through shorts, three things happened. First, I was confused what is happening. I wanted to watch the movies now, and Papa Ute Afro Soul remix was stuck in my head. So I decided to start my own spy movie journey to find out what is the greatest spy franchise ever made. James Bond, Mission Impossible, or Jason Bourne. And for the true connoisseurs out there, maybe Johnny English or Austin Powers, whatever suits your fancy. I thought if I watched every Bond film, every Jason Bourne film, and every Mission Impossible in chronological order, I'd finally have an answer. So I did that. I watched 39 spy movies. Something strange happened. The further I got into the marathon, the less interested I became in ranking them. Because after enough movies, the individual plots begin to blur together. Another terrorist, another government conspiracy, another secret organization, there are a lot of those. Another impossible mission, another chase through Europe, India, or a Latin American city. Another villain convinced that this time they alone understand how to reshape the world. You stop remembering every plot twist, but you start to remember the patterns, the broad strokes. Things you would never notice if you watched one Bond film this month, a Mission Impossible 6 months later, and a Jason Bourne. Well, nobody watches that, but watching them back to back to back changes your perspective. It stops feeling like you're watching separate films. Instead, it feels like you're watching one genre argue with itself for 60 years. Not that which franchise is the best, but what does each franchise believe a spy should be? Because despite sharing the same genre, these movies are trying to accomplish completely different things. James Bond is the relaxed, suave British gentleman, sipping one martini at a time. Jason Bourne is trying to walk out of the situation. And Mission Impossible, well, it does not really care if you remember anything, it keeps on reminding you. Each one values something different. James Bond came first, way before 1962. That sounds obvious, of course he did. Everybody knows Bond, James Bond. In fact, 6 of them on the big screen, plus one parody actor and now one for the gamers. But I don't simply mean that Bond arrived before Jason Bourne or Ethan Hunt. I mean that modern spy cinema was a product of Ian Fleming's book James Bond. Because Bond did not just create a successful franchise, he created this genre, a separate league of its own. The tailored suits, Aston Martin, nifty gadgets, extravagant villains and their memorable henchmen, glamorous locations, and even glamorous Bond girls. The now iconic trademark opening gun barrel scene, and a new song every movie. The theme songs that somehow became just as popular as the movies themselves. Bond had already figured out something incredible. People were not returning just for stories, they were returning for the vibe, the experience. Every new actor inherited the same name, the same job, the same secretary, the same quartermaster, yet somehow still was not stale. That's a remarkable achievement, especially when you consider that this franchise has survived changing audiences, changing technology, politics, and changing definitions of masculinity or what is acceptable to be shown on screen without losing its identity. Some Bond movies are genuinely difficult to defend. Let us just say they are the products of their time. Some are wonderful, some are surprisingly emotional. It has adapted very well to the changing tastes of its audience. Bond never survived because every movie was excellent. Bond survived because as generations changed, the Bond changed with them, altering ever so slightly just to suit the taste of the new generation. The 60s had Sean Connery and George Lazenby, the 70s had their Roger Moore, 80s with Timothy Dalton, 90s with Pierce Brosnan, and the 2000s with Daniel Craig. Every generation somehow rediscovered Bond. As time went on from the first few Bonds, the world changed. The Cold War ended, governments became more secretive, the people wanted something new. The optimism of old spy adventures was slowly getting colder. Then came Mission Impossible. Not as a replacement for Bond, but as the reply to the new demand of the same fantasy. When Brian De Palma's Mission Impossible arrived in 1996 on the big screen, after almost 30 years of Bruce Geller's TV show by the same name, it had completely transformed the definition that Bond had set. There were impossible infiltrations, elaborate disguises, high-tech gadgets, and a hero who could charm anyone. Obviously he could. Look at that smile. Then 6 years later, the genre experienced another shift. A man woke up floating in the Mediterranean Sea with 2 bullets in the back and absolutely no idea who he was. Jason Bourne did not simply introduce a new spy, it was a cross between Max Payne, John Wick, and Agent 47, although John Wick released 12 years later. By this time, a lot had changed. Gone were the tuxedos, the witty one-liners, gone were the colorful villains patiently explaining elaborate master plans, while the protagonist was waiting for them to finish. Gone was this fantasy. Instead, Bourne made it uncomfortable. What if becoming the world's greatest agent wasn't glamorous? What if it was just getting abused? What if the government did not create heroes but demons? Bond made espionage look aspirational. Ethan Hunt made it look cool, and Jason Bourne made it look tragic. And I loved it. Looking back today, it is difficult to overstate how influential those first 3 Jason Bourne films became. They did not become successful because they copied Bond, they became successful because they deliberately rejected him. For years now, audiences love grounded stories as close to reality as possible. If he could do it in a tuxedo, that could equally well be done in just a hoodie. With this new vibe, even James Bond eventually changed. Daniel Craig's Bond feels more gritty and grounded, also much more emotionally invested than previous ones. Bond acknowledged and improved. But perhaps the most fascinating response came from Mission Impossible. The franchise that had begun in 1996 felt quite grounded initially, but over the next 2 decades it gradually accepted a new formula. Bigger is better. Today it is almost impossible to talk about Mission Impossible without first mentioning Tom Cruise hanging from an airplane, scaling the Burj Khalifa, fighting on top of a speeding train, or riding a motorcycle off a cliff. It stopped caring how clever is the mission or how can we make it more spy-like. Instead it asked how impossible can we make the next stunt. It is like the directors asked how high is the jump and Cruise said yes. How big is the explosion? Cruise said yes. Remarkably, audiences love both. 3 franchises, 2.5 enormous successes. Which brings us back to the question, if these movies all begin with the same basic premise, why do they leave such completely different impressions? Before we compare the stories they tell, we first have to understand the men telling them. James Bond sacrifices anonymity. He is probably the least discreet secret agent ever. He introduces himself to everyone. He wears expensive suits, drives cars specifically designed to attract attention. He walks into casinos where everyone knows who he is. For someone whose job is supposed to be invisible, Bond is remarkably visible. And somehow that is not bad, because Bond was never trying to be realistic, he is a fantasy. Bond is not pretending to be an ordinary man trying to do extraordinary things. He is an extraordinary man doing extraordinary things. His enemies build volcano lairs. He goes to space to fight a war, for God's sake. There is nothing ordinary about this man. The characters are made to be memorable with unforgettable names: Oddjob, Jaws, Knick-Knack, Tee-Hee, Pussy Galore, Plenty O'Toole, Octopussy, etc. The writers were not trying to hide the joke, and Bond never apologizes for that. In fact, I think that's one of the franchise's greatest strengths. It understands exactly what it is. Jason Bourne exists at the opposite end of the spectrum. Nobody knows who Jason Bourne is, including Jason Bourne himself. He does not wear suits because they look cool. He wears whatever allows him to disappear. He doesn't drive Aston Martins. Half the time he just steals the nearest car. Bond walks into a room wanting to be noticed. Bourne spends every second hoping nobody notices him. Even the way they fight reflects that difference. Bond looks composed, calculated, cool. Bourne looks desperate. He fights with books, rolled up magazines, and a pen. He almost killed a man with a pen. Reminds me of someone else I know. Then there's Ethan Hunt, and this is where my opinion changed the most during the marathon. Before watching any MI films, I would have described Ethan Hunt as another secret agent. After watching them all, I don't think that's close. Ethan Hunt is something else entirely. Throughout Mission Impossible movies, someone else makes a mistake and creates a catastrophe. Then Ethan arrives, not to investigate or spy. He arrives to solve a disaster that is already happening. The IMF feels less like an intelligence agency and more like an emergency response unit for global catastrophes. Ethan is the person everyone calls when nobody else can fix it. He does it again and again and again. He is closer to a firefighter than a traditional spy. Whenever there's a firefighter runs into the building. Suddenly, his constant running makes perfect sense. By this point, I had stopped thinking about Bond, Bourne, and Hunt as three characters. Instead, they had become three different solutions to the same problem, because every spy film eventually runs into the same questions. How do you tell the story? How do you keep the audience engaged? How do you raise the stakes? The fascinating part is that these three franchises almost never arrive at the same answer. Let us start with the basics. In James Bond, there is always M, there is Q and Moneypenny. The world remembers what Bond is, right? But until Daniel Craig, Bond movies never expected you to remember what happened. Let us say 3 films ago. That is how it went. You always remembered the characters but not the story. So you could watch any Bond movie any day in any order, and your experience will be fine. You could watch Goldfinger, then jump straight to The Spy Who Loved Me, then GoldenEye, and you'd never feel lost. Each adventure stood on its own, like a single episode. That wasn't laziness, it was by design. Bond was built to survive decades, changing actors and changing audiences. Every film was another assignment. Mission Impossible follows a surprisingly similar philosophy. Yes, Luther returns, Benji returns, there are recurring relationships, but every film still begins the same way. A new threat, a new mission, and Ethan to the rescue. You are not expected to remember every detail from 3 films earlier. In fact, they explain whatever is required to remember in each film. It is so repetitive that if you have seen one movie, just watch YouTube shorts and guess the plots of the remaining ones. At some point, Tom Cruise needs to stop running, both himself and this franchise. Jason Bourne is different, completely different. The original trilogy isn't 3 adventures, it is 1. If the Bourne identity is the first act, then Supremacy is the second and Ultimatum is the ending. Watching them individually is confusing. Fun but confusing. Watching them back to back makes sense. It is no longer just loosely related movies under the same umbrella, it is a proper sequel continuing the same story. The first film asks who Jason Bourne is, the second shows what was done to him, and the third is resolution. It's one continuous emotional arc. But sadly, they made two more. The Bourne Legacy found an interesting way to expand the universe without undoing Jason's story. I was fine with it. But 2016 Jason Bourne asked, what if Jason came back? See, if you keep on bringing a great character back, after a resolution you will only spoil the ending. John Wick also suffers from this trope. They kept on bringing him back. Sometimes knowing when to stop is just as important as knowing how to continue. Another important detail was pacing, or simply put, how these movies make us feel between action scenes. Halfway through the marathon, I noticed something that sounds almost ridiculous when you first hear it. Bond takes time to breathe. I know that's a strange thing to say, but once I noticed it, I could not stop seeing it and appreciating it. James Bond is allowed rest. After an action sequence, it slows down. There is time for Bond to exchange a few sarcastic remarks with Q, time to walk through a casino, time to admire a car, appreciate the location. Sometimes nothing important happens for several minutes. The films never seem afraid that the audience might become bored. Mission Impossible has the opposite philosophy. The instant one problem is solved, another appears immediately. Someone is already counting down, someone has already been captured, a bomb is already armed, the next stunt is already waiting. The films are incredibly efficient but also very intense. The tension never completely disappears. That sounds like a praise until you realize that tension only works because it is contrasted with relief. If everything is urgent, nothing feels especially urgent. It's like listening to music that is played at maximum volume for 3 straight hours. Jason Bourne follows a similar approach. His films rarely slow down either, but they don't rely on constant spectacle, they rely on paranoia. Every train station feels dangerous. Every hotel room feels temporary. Anyone could be watching. It is a much more engaging way without feeling repetitive. That difference becomes even clearer when you look at the stakes. Modern blockbusters have developed an unfortunate habit. Every sequel has to be bigger. The consequences have to be more catastrophic. By the later MI films, Ethan Hunt isn't simply stopping a terrorist, he is stopping global destruction in every movie. Eventually, the phrase, "the biggest mission yet," starts sounding less like a promise and more like a requirement. That's the danger of escalation. Yes, escalation is exciting until it becomes expected. Bond quietly avoids this trap. How? Because every decade a new actor resets the playing field. The franchise isn't constantly trying to outdo itself, it starts from scratch. One film can be about Fort Knox, the next about revenge, another about a poker game. When the stakes get too high, they reset. In Jason Bourne's case, the stakes are very low to begin with. Just one man and his life. The world isn't ending, his stories are deeply personal. He is not trying to save humanity, he is trying to understand who stole his humanity. And strangely enough, those smaller stakes often feel better. Watching all 3 franchises together convinced me, personal stakes feel bigger than global ones. I may forget the name of another doomsday device or another evil organization, but I will never forget Tracy, I would not forget Madeline, and Bond will never forget Vesper. And I certainly don't forget why Jason Bourne is running. The older I get, the less interested I become in stories about saving the world. The world gets saved every summer. But one person trying to save themselves, that stays with me. The deeper I went into the marathon, another pattern emerged. Each government agency in these movies spends an extraordinary time cleaning up its own mistakes. MI6 has its political crisis. The IMF is constantly one step away from being disavowed. The CIA, Well, the CIA practically has a side business of manufacturing its own villains. Treadstone, Blackbriar, Outcome, Larks. Every time one program is exposed, another one quietly appears with a different name. It is almost funny. Almost. They are convincing themselves that the next secret program will somehow avoid repeating the mistakes of the last one. It is the cinematic equivalent of touching a hot stove, burning your hand, and then deciding the solution is to build an even hotter stove. That's one of my favorite recurring themes in Jason Bourne universe. The enemy is not incompetence, it is institutional arrogance. The belief that this time they will control the monster they created. Unfortunately, they never do. Somewhere around the end, I started noticing the decisions made by the people who are responsible for these franchises for decades. Namely, the Broccoli family for Bond, also Saltzman and others working at Eon, Tom Cruise and Matt Damon for the other two franchises, as they were personally involved in the production. Eventually, every long-running franchise arrives at exactly the same crossroads. Do you change or do you become obsolete? James Bond faced that question more times than any other franchise here, from 1962 till 2021, and somehow it kept surviving. That's what amazed me the most. Not that Bond has existed for over 60 years, but that Connery, Lazenby, Moore, Dalton, Brosnan and Craig all feel like James Bond. That should not have been possible, right? Think about how radically cinema changed between Dr. No and No Time to Die. The internet arrived, satellites brought everything closer, cyber warfare became a thing, global pandemics and artificial intelligence became the newest global fear. Action cinema became louder, longer, faster. Hollywood changed beyond recognition. But Bond is still here, and popular in fact. There is going to be a new Bond under Amazon in a few years. Another hard reboot. A Bond for the Gen Z maybe. He adapted without abandoning his identity. That is where I think Bond succeeded better than almost any franchise in cinema. Connery built the blueprint. Lazenby quietly introduced something audiences would not fully appreciate for decades. An emotional Bond. A Bond who could fall in love and get married. To this day, I feel Tracy's role in Bond history is underappreciated. Roger Moore expanded Bond into pure entertainment. Sometimes wonderfully ridiculous, sometimes gloriously excessive. Timothy Dalton arrived years before audiences were ready for him. Watching his films today almost feels like discovering an early draft of Daniel Craig. Then Brosnan modernized Bond for the new world. He became the Bond I love the most. The perfect balance between charm and danger. And finally, Daniel Craig did something no Bond actor before him had been allowed to do. He started a story and finished it. Not just a mission, a complete life story. Craig's era also changed something else. His relationships. For decades, Bond girls were almost treated as another franchise tradition. A new movie, a new woman. Craig broke that pattern. Vesper changed Bond. Vesper reminded us what losing love looked like, just like Tracy did in the 60s. Madeline became something important. She wasn't simply another Bond girl, she became Bond's future. Whether people love or hate No Time to Die, one thing is undeniable. Bond's priorities had completely changed. The man who once lived entirely for Queen and country was suddenly willing to die for something much smaller. One woman, one child. His world became smaller, but his emotions much larger. And then I looked back at Ethan Hunt. Surprisingly, the opposite had happened. Craig's Bond kept narrowing his emotional world. Ethan Hunt kept expanding his. Julia Mead, Ilsa, Grace. Again and again, Ethan finds another person he feels responsible for. And mostly that responsibility is romantic. His emotional circle keeps growing. He makes sure everybody survives. Nobody gets left behind. It's one of Ethan Hunt's most admirable qualities. It is also the reason I gradually felt something becoming repetitive. Every new major female character eventually ends up becoming another love interest. Ironically, Bond, who spent decades being criticized for disposable relationships, misogyny, poorly written female characters, ended his run with fewer relationships but stronger ones. That wasn't something I expected to discover before this marathon. Mission Impossible surprised me in another way. When I began watching these films, I genuinely thought Mission Impossible would become my favorite franchise. How could it not? The practical stunts were astonishing. Tom Cruise has accomplished things that probably shouldn't have been practical. The Burj Khalifa, the Halo jump, the motorcycle cliff jump, running, an extraordinary amount of running. That's where I think MI made a choice that Bond skipped. Bond became smaller, Mission Impossible escalated. There is nothing wrong with escalation, but after 8 films, watched back to back to back, I began feeling its limits. And perhaps that is the strangest compliment I can give to Tom Cruise. He became so successful at doing the impossible that the impossible stopped surprising me. So after finishing all the films, my own rankings have quietly changed. Although I do not believe these franchises were competing with each other, all 3 succeeded, just in different ways. But still keeping things simple, I think James Bond is definitely my favorite, with Jason Bourne coming next, and then Mission Impossible. But now adding some nuance to it. If I want the greatest story, I am choosing the Bourne trilogy. If I want to witness filmmaking spectacle at its absolute peak, I am choosing Mission Impossible, and if I simply want to have the best evening, I am choosing James Bond every single time. And perhaps that's the biggest surprise of this entire marathon. I expected Bond to feel old. Instead, he felt timeless. I expected Mission Impossible to become my favorite. Instead, it became predictable. I expected Jason Bourne to be shorter. Instead, it became the franchise that lingered for some reason. That's why I don't think this marathon answered the question I started with. Which spy franchise is the best? It was replaced with, what kind of spy story do you want to experience?